The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm golden hue over the winding road as Special FBI Agent Rachel Johnson gripped the steering wheel of her unmarked sedan. Her dark eyes, sharp and perceptive, flickered with a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. Months of relentless pursuit had brought her to the cusp of dismantling a ruthless drug cartel shadowy network that thrived in the underbelly of society, peddling poison and fear. She'd spent countless nights poring over cryptic clues, tracing their movements through whispered rumors and grainy surveillance footage. Now, as she drove back to the office, a faint flicker of relief stirred within her, tempered by the weight of knowing the fight was far from over. Pride swelled in her chest, not the loud, boastful kind, but the steady, hard-earned kind that came from proving herself time and again in a world that often doubted her. Rachel wasn't just another agent in the FBI's ranks. As a black woman in a field dominated by white men, her journey had been a grueling uphill climb, marked by obstacles that would have broken a lesser spirit. From her first days at the agency, she'd felt the sting of skeptical stare-size that lingered a little too long, sizing her up as if her presence were an anomaly. Whispers followed her, thinly veiled comments about her competence or her place among them. But Rachel had never flinched. She'd met every challenge with a steely resolve, her intelligence and grit carving out a reputation that silenced the doubters. Her colleagues, once distant, now relied on her tenacity, entrusting her with cases like this one: high-stakes, high-pressure missions that demanded nothing less than excellence. Lost in thought, she replayed the investigation's latest threads in her mind, her fingers tapping absently on the wheel. The cartel's patterns were starting to crystallize, each fragment of evidence slotting into place like a puzzle she was born to solve. She could almost taste the breakthrough, so close, yet still elusive. Then, a sudden flash of red and blue pierced the stillness, snapping her back to the present. Her gaze darted to the rearview mirror, where the pulsing lights of a police cruiser loomed. Surprise rippled through her. She glanced at the speedometer, steady, well within the limit. "What's this about?" she murmured, a crease forming on her brow as she eased the car to the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The police cruiser rolled to a stop behind her, its engine idling with a low growl. A tall figure emerged, his silhouette stark against the fading daylight. Officer Thompson, his name tag glinted faintly, strode toward her with a deliberate slowness that set her nerves on edge. His face was a mask of stern lines, his eyes cold and unyielding, like shards of ice beneath a furrowed brow. His hand rested casually on the holster at his hip, a subtle but unmistakable signal of authority. Rachel steadied her breathing, rolling down her window as he approached. She'd dealt with her share of prickly cops before. This was nothing she couldn't handle. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice calm and measured, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Is there a problem?" Her hand hovered near her FBI badge, ready to clarify who she was. But Thompson didn't return her courtesy. His gaze raked over her, sharp and dismissive, as if she were a nuisance rather than a fellow law enforcement officer. "License and registration," he barked, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth. Rachel blinked, caught off guard by the hostility radiating from him. She leaned forward slightly, her badge now in hand. "I'm an FBI agent, just back from a mission," she explained, holding it up for him to see. The silver emblem gleamed in the dim light, a symbol of her authority and years of sacrifice. Yet Thompson barely spared it a glance, his lips curled into a sneer, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I said license and registration. Didn't you hear me?" A chill crept up Rachel's spine. There was something in his eyes: disdain, yes, but also something darker, more personal. She'd seen that look before, in fleeting moments over the years, the unspoken judgment that came not from her actions, but from who she was. Still, she kept her composure, her training kicking in like a second skin. "I'm on an official FBI investigation," she said, her words deliberate, her tone steady despite the unease coiling in her gut. "This is critical work, and I assure you, there's no violation here." She hoped reason would pierce through his aggression, that he'd recognize the absurdity of this encounter. Instead, Thompson's expression hardened. He leaned closer, his shadow falling over her, and his voice dropped to a menacing growl. "I don't care who you are. Step out of the car right now, or I'll drag you out myself. The threat hung heavy between them, laced with a venom that made her pulse quicken. Time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing to the space between them. Beyond the car, a few passers-by slowed their steps, their curious gazes turning toward the scene. Some fumbled for their phones, the faint glow of screens flickering in the dusk. Rachel's chest tightened, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. She tried once more, her voice firm but controlled. "Officer, I'm an FBI agent on duty. You have no legal grounds to treat me this way." Thompson's response was a smirk, cold and mocking, his eyes glinting with contempt. He stepped closer, peering at her badge as if it were a cheap trinket. "You think that little badge means you're untouchable? I told you to show your license, and you didn't. FBI or not, I don't care." His words dripped with scorn, each syllable a jab at her dignity. Rachel's heart pounded, a storm of emotions swirling within her: frustration, disbelief, and a creeping sense of vulnerability she hadn't felt in years. She'd faced down armed criminals, navigated life-or-death stakes, yet here she was, cornered by a man who saw her not as an equal, but as a target. Swallowing her rising fury, she reached for her license and registration, determined to de-escalate before this spiraled further. But Thompson had no interest in protocol. In a flash, he seized her arm, his grip bruising as he yanked her from the car. Pain shot through her wrist as he twisted it behind her back, the cold bite of handcuffs snapping into place. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp with outrage as the metal dug into her skin. "I haven't broken any laws. This is abuse of power." Thompson laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the quiet evening. "Abuse of power," he mocked, towering over her. "In this town, I am the law. You think that badge puts you above me? I don't give a damn about it." Humiliation burned in Rachel's throat as he shoved her toward the patrol car. The growing crowd murmured, their phones trained on her like spotlights, capturing every moment of her disgrace. She felt exposed, stripped of the armor she'd built over years of service. Thompson's eyes gleamed with a sick satisfaction, as if her public degradation fed some twisted pride within him. Justice, she thought bitterly, where was it now? She'd devoted her life to upholding it, only to be trampled by a man who wielded his authority like a weapon. As she stumbled forward, a second officer emerged from the cruiser, a weary man with a pinched face and darting eyes. Hope flared briefly in Rachel's chest. Surely he'd see the madness of this and step in. But he only glanced at her, then at Thompson, his expression a mask of cowardice. He shifted uncomfortably, hands stuffed in his pockets, unwilling to challenge the bully beside him. Disappointment crashed over her, heavy and suffocating. "You don't have the right to do this," she protested as Thompson forced her into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a finality that rattled her bones. "I'm entitled to contact my superiors. It's my right." His scoff was the last thing she heard before the darkness of the car swallowed her. "You'll get your rights when I say so. Now shut up and sit still." The handcuffs bit deeper, her wrists throbbing as the patrol car lurched forward. Through the tinted windows, she saw the onlookers, some gawking, others recording, none daring to intervene. Loneliness settled over her like a shroud. She'd faced danger countless times, stared down threats to protect the innocent, yet here she was, powerless against a system that should have been her ally. Her mind raced, memories flooding back, the grueling academy days, the sleepless nights chasing leads, the quiet moments of doubt she'd pushed aside to keep going. She'd sacrificed so much, friendships faded, family gatherings missed all for a badge that now felt like a hollow shield. In the silence, her mother's voice echoed, soft but unyielding. "Strength isn't just about winning, Rochelle, it's about rising every time you fall. No one defines your worth but you." Those words had carried her through every trial, a lifeline she clung to now. Thompson's actions weren't just an attack on her, they were a betrayal of everything she stood for. Power had warped him, blinded him to the justice he was meant to serve. And yet, as the car rolled through the night, Rachel's resolve hardened. She wouldn't let this break her. She'd fight not just for herself, but for every soul who'd ever been crushed under the weight of unchecked authority. Justice demanded it, and she'd see it through, no matter the cost. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Rachel's wrists, each jagged edge a cruel reminder of the indignity she now endured. She sat in the back of the patrol car, her body jostled by the uneven road, yet her spirit remained unbroken. Beyond the smudged window, the fleeting glow of streetlights painted fleeting streaks across her face, illuminating the fierce determination etched into her features. Humiliation gnawed at her, a bitter taste that mingled with the sting of injustice. But her eyes blazed with an unyielding fire. She refused to let this moment define her. Rachel knew that surrendering now, allowing the weight of this ordeal to crush her, would mean handing victory to men like Thompson, those who wielded their authority like a blunt weapon to batter the defenseless. That was something she could never permit. The night air was thick with tension as the car rolled on, its tires humming a monotonous tune against the asphalt. Rachel's mind churned, a storm of defiance brewing beneath her composed exterior. She thought of Thompson, his smug grin, the cold glint in his eyes as he'd barked orders at her, and felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just about her pride. It was about the countless others who had trembled under his shadow, their voices silenced by fear. If she didn't fight back, if she let this pass unchallenged, his reign of unchecked power would only grow, spreading like a dark stain across the vulnerable lives he was meant to protect. No, she decided, clenching her fists despite the cuff's sharp bite. The moment she regained her freedom, she would unleash everything she had every contact, every resorcetto, drag his corruption into the light. Justice wasn't just a word to Rachel, it was the bedrock of her existence, a cause she'd bled for, sacrificed for, and she'd be damned if she let Thompson mock it with his abuse. When the patrol car lurched to a stop outside the police station, its faded bricks looming under the dim streetlights, Rachel's plan was already taking shape. The challenges ahead loomed large, dangerous, unpredictable, a gauntlet of threats and isolation, but she welcomed them. Each pang of pain, each bitter setback, would fuel her. She'd transform this nightmare into a weapon, a blazing torch to guide her forward. Her iron will flared within her, a beacon against the encroaching darkness, promising to lead her through whatever trials awaited. She understood the road would be grueling, a marathon of stacked odds and crushing losses. But Rachel was no stranger to hardship. This wasn't merely a duty, it was her calling, her mission as an FBI agent who'd stared down skepticism and scorned to claim her place. She fought not just for herself, but for every soul who'd ever been crushed under the heel of oppression, those faceless, voiceless masses she'd sworn to champion. Thompson might be ruthless, a titan of power in his own mind, but he'd never snuff out her ideals. Every risk she took, every step forward, was a testament to the courage that had forged her life's purpose. Inside the holding cell, the air was stale and heavy, pressing against her like a physical force daring her to break. Rachel sat on the narrow bench, her gaze fixed on the damp, peeling wall before her. The flickering bulb overhead cast a weak, trembling light, barely pushing back the gloom of the cramped space. Everything here felt abandoned: worn benches, chipped paint, a faint mildew scent clinging to the corners, as if the law itself had forsaken this place. She realized with chilling clarity why Thompson had brought her here. This wasn't just any station. It was a remote outpost, a forgotten corner where his influence could twist reality unchecked. If she cried out, no one would hear. If she disappeared, no one would question it. The isolation wrapped around her like a shroud, and for a fleeting moment, despair clawed at her chest. She thought of the years she'd spent clawing her way up, in the enduring sit-along glances from colleagues, the unspoken doubts of a white, male-dominated world, the quiet jeers she'd turned into fuel. She'd earned her badge through grit and unrelenting effort, only to find herself here, stripped of dignity by a petty tyrant flexing his power. Thompson's voice echoed in her memory, sharp, mocking, dripping with contempt as he'd ordered her from her car. To him, she wasn't a federal agent, a protector of the innocent. She was just a black woman, a target he could crush to feed his ego. The realization tightened her throat, a mix of fury and sorrow swelling within her. He'd trampled the very principles she'd devoted her life to upholding, turning his badge into a bludgeon rather than a shield. But as the anger simmered, it hardened into something stronger. Isolve. She'd faced worse than Thompson, enemies far more cunning, threats far more lethal, and she hadn't buckled then. She wouldn't now. Her eyes drifted to the chipped metal table beside her, where a styrofoam cup of water sat untouched. The faint light caught its surface, a tiny glimmer in the oppressive dark, and it steadied her. She still had a choice. She could still fight. She'd find a way to reach her superiors, no matter the obstacles. Not just to free herself, but to dismantle the corrupt web Thompson had spun. Officers like him thrived in the shadows. She'd flood them with light. Rachel forced herself to breathe evenly, her mind racing despite the stillness. Acting rashly could sink her deeper into this mess, but passivity wasn't an option either. Years of training surged to the forefront, hours spent honing patience, mastering strategy under pressure, and she leaned on them now like a lifeline. She closed her eyes, the cell's emptiness pressing in, and mapped her next moves. Outside, the night sky hung heavy and gray, a mirror to the turmoil within her. But she refused to let it dim her spirit. She'd vowed long ago to be a voice for the voiceless, and now that vow included herself. As she sat there, the faces of other hosts who'd suffered silently under men like Thompson flashed through her mind. Their pain, their helplessness, stoked the fire in her chest. She'd rise for them, a lone spark against the dark, determined to expose the rot festering in this system. The silence was broken by the groan of the cell door swinging open. A young officer stepped in, his frame slight against the hulking metal frame, carrying a tray with a meager mealdry bread and a bruised apple. His name tag glinted faintly, Ryan. Rachel recognized the name from passing mentions among local cops. A rookie she'd never met, but whose reputation as a quiet, earnest sort had trickled through the grapevine. He set the tray down without meeting her eyes, his movements stiff, almost mechanical. But there was something else, a flicker of unease in the way he shifted his weight, the way his fingers lingered on the tray before pulling back. Rachel seized the moment, her voice cutting through the quiet with calm, deliberate strength. Ryan, please, I need your help. He froze, caught off guard, his hazel eyes darting to her then away again. The air between them thickened with his hesitation. I can't, he muttered, his voice low and strained, as if the words pained him. I'm not supposed to get involved. Thompson has got too much pull here. But beneath the tension, Rachel caught a thread of something softer, empathy, maybe even guilt. She pressed forward, her tone steady but warm, coaxing. I get it, Ryan. You're scared. But you've seen him do this before, haven't you? You've watched him twist his power into something ugly. If he keeps going, more people will suffer. This isn't justice, it's the opposite. Ryan's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening as if wrestling with a truth he didn't want to face. He glanced at her, just for a second, then dropped his gaze to the floor. I know, he whispered, barely audible, but he controls everything here. He threatens people, makes us afraid. We're all terrified of what he'll do if we cross him. His voice cracked, revealing the weight he carried, a young man caught in a machine he didn't know how to stop. Rachel inhaled deeply, her anger at Thompson mingling with a growing resolve to reach Ryan's buried conscience. I'm an FBI agent, Ryan. I'm here to do my job, not to be locked up like this. If you help me contact my superiors, I'll protect ya, we swear it. This isn't just about me. It's about the values you signed up for when you put on that uniform. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes clouded with conflict. Rachel could see a war between fear and duty raging inside him. She softened her voice, leaning into his humanity. You became a cop for a reason, Ryan. Maybe it was to help people, to stand for what's right. But if we let fear win, how long will that mean anything? If Thompson can do this to me today, who's next? You don't have to keep watching this happen. He stood rooted, his hands clenched at his sides, a quiet sorrow flickering across his face. After a long pause, he sighed, the sound heavy with surrender. I don't like what he's doing, he admitted, his shoulders slumping. But helping you, it could cost me everything. He'd come after me, my family. Rachel felt the depth of his fear, the realness of it, but she also saw the crack in his armor. Ryan wasn't like Thompson, he hadn't been hollowed out by power yet. She held his gaze, her own eyes burning with conviction. I know the risk, Ryan, but doing nothing costs more. It costs your soul. Help me, and we'll fight this together. The cell fell silent again, save for the faint hum of the flickering light. Ryan's chest rose and fell, his decision teetering on the edge. Rachel waited, her heart pounding, knowing that in this moment, justice hung not just on her will, but on the fragile courage of a man who'd glimpsed the cost of power's abuse. In the dim confines of the cell, Rachel felt the weight of Thompson's intentions pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. He wasn't just a man with power. He was a predator who thrived on fear, carefully crafting an atmosphere so thick with dread that no one dared to defy him. She could almost see the smirk curling his lips as he imagined the trembling obedience of those under his thumb. But Rachel wasn't like the others. She edged closer to Ryan, her heart pounding yet steady, her voice slipping out in a whisper that carried the strength of iron. "I get it, Ryan. I know what he's doing, scaring us into submission. But there are times when doing what's right means stepping into the fire, even if it burns. You don't have to face this alone. If you stand with me, I'll shield you. Together, we can drag all his darkness into the light." Ryan stood there, caught in a storm of his own making. His eyes darted back and forth, flickering with a tangle of fear and something that looked like the first fragile roots of courage pushing through cracked soil. The silence stretched between them, heavy and tense, until he finally drew in a deep, shuddering breath. When his gaze locked with Rachel's, there was a spark of decision in it. "I'll help you," he said, his words quick and sharp, laced with a urgency that betrayed his nerves. "But it has to be quiet when no one's around to see. I'll come back after my shift ends. You'll need to stay low until then." His voice trembled slightly, but his resolve held firm, like a thin wire stretched taut but unbroken. Rachel's lips curved into a small, grateful smile, her eyes softening with appreciation as she nodded. "Thank you, Ryan. I won't let your bravery slip through my fingers, promise you that." As he turned to leave, the soft creak of his boots against the cold floor echoed faintly in the cell. When the door clicked shut behind him, the silence rushed back in, thick and oppressive. But it couldn't smother the ember of hope now glowing in Rachel's chest. It was fragile, yes, but it burned with a fierce intensity she hadn't felt in days. Ryan had done something extraordinary. He'd reached past the paralyzing grip of fear and duty to offer her a lifeline. She knew the risk he was taking wasn't small. It was a towering gamble that could topple everything he'd built. That knowledge stirred not just gratitude in her, but a deeper, fiercer determination. She swore to herself, in the stillness of that moment, that his courage wouldn't be wasted. The cell was a tomb of shadows now, its walls pressing in with a stifling quiet that seemed to mock her captivity. Rachel sank onto the hard bench, the darkness wrapping around her like a shroud. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of plans and possibilities spinning behind her closed eyes. Days of confinement had worn her down with endless threats from Thompson, and his cronies had gnawed at her spirit, but now, something had shifted. She wasn't as isolated as she'd been. Ryan was a crack in the wall, a sliver of light piercing the gloom. She replayed their hushed conversation in her head, his hesitant but firm promise, the way his jaw had tightened with resolve. To her, it wasn't just a fleeting exchange, it was a beacon, a vivid reminder that her struggle wasn't hers alone. She was fighting for everyone Thompson had trampled, every soul he'd buried under his ruthless reign. Justice wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a living flame inside her, fed by every injustice she'd witnessed. If their plan crumbled, the consequences would be brutal. Thompson wouldn't hesitate to grind them both into dust. This power was a machine, relentless and unforgiving, built to crush any flicker of rebellion. The thought sat heavy on her shoulders, a weight that could have broken her before. But now, it didn't drag her down, it sharpened her. She wasn't the helpless woman locked away anymore, unjustly caged by a corrupt hand. She was a warrior, forged in the fire of this ordeal, ready to wield justice like a blade. Sitting there in the dark, Rachel closed her eyes, her breath slow and deliberate, each one a quiet act of defiance against despair. Patience was her ally. She had to wait for Ryan's return, for the moment when they could strike. His choice had carved a narrow path forward, and she'd be damned if she let it close. That flame of justice burned hotter with every passing second, each spark igniting a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She felt it in her bones, an unyielding force, growing into something unstoppable. Rachel's thoughts drifted to the world beyond these walls, the innocent people who'd placed their trust in Thompson, blind to the web of lies he'd spun for his own gain. She wasn't just battling for her freedom, she was fighting for them, for the truth they deserved, for the justice he'd stolen from them. The realization lit her up inside, a torch blazing against the night, its glow refusing to fade. As she waited, her mind sharpened, sketching out every move she'd need to make. How could she reach her superiors without Thompson's hounds sniffing her out? How could she slip through his grasp undetected? She'd have to be cunning, swift, and silent. Every second mattered. Every step a delicate dance on a razor's edge. Night after night, the cell's darkness swallowed her whole, but Rachel held fast. Her willpower, tempered by suffering and sacrifice, had become a shield, a weapon, a lifeline. She wouldn't let men like Thompson dictate her fate or anyone else's. Opening her eyes, she stared into the void, her heartbeat steady and strong, each pulse a drumbeat of resolve. She wasn't just waiting anymore. Ash was preparing. The showdown was coming. A reckoning she'd chase until the truth blazed bright for all to see. Nothing that Thompson, not his power, not the suffocating walls around her, could stop her now. Meanwhile, Ryan wrestled with his own storm. Hours after leaving Rachel, he paced the empty locker room, the hum of the station's fluorescent lights buzzing in his ears. His hands shook as he dragged them through his hair, his mind a battlefield of doubt and duty. He'd always been the quiet one, the officer who kept his head down and followed orders. But standing by while Thompson twisted the law into a noose felt wrong, sickeningly wrong. Helping Rachel could cost him everything, his job, his safety, maybe more. Yet the memory of her steady gaze, the steel in her voice, gnawed at him. When night draped the remote police station in its inky veil, he made his choice. The shadows were his cover, the stillness his chance. He crept back to her cell, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, every creak of the floorboards a shout in the silence. He peered around corners, his breath shallow, ensuring no one lingered in the dim corridors. When he reached her door, Rachel was ready. Her eyes caught the faint light, alive with hope and grit. She rose silently, her movements fluid despite days of captivity. As if she'd been waiting for this exact moment, Ryan signaled for quiet, his fingers trembling as he slid the key into the lock. The cuffs fell from her wrists with a soft clink, and he whispered, "We've got to move, Ano." His voice was tight, his eyes darting to the door, but there was no mistaking the fire in them. Rachel nodded, her pulse racing but her breathing controlled, a testament to the strength she'd clung to. They slipped into the station's dark arteries, Ryan leading the way through a maze of back passages he'd memorized over months of late shifts. His boots barely touched the ground, his every step calculated to avoid the places where Thompson's loyalists might lurk. The air was thick with tension, the silence a fragile thing that could shatter at any moment. They were so close to the back exit, freedom just a breath away, when the alarm screamed to life, a piercing wail that ripped through the night and jolted the station awake. Rachel's stomach dropped, her eyes locking with Ryan's. Fear flashed there, but neither of them faltered. "Run," Ryan hissed, shoving the door open and pulling her into the cool night air. They bolted across the parking lot, the faint glow of distant streetlights their only guide, their shadows stretching long and thin behind them. The gravel crunched under their feet, each step a desperate lunge toward escape. But then a voice sliced through the darkness, sharp and venomous. "Ryan, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Thompson's words dripped with fury, a promise of retribution that made the hair on Rachel's neck stand on end. They didn't stop, didn't look back, just pushed harder, the station fading into the distance as Thompson's shouts rallied his pack. The chase was on, alleyways twisted before them, narrow and claustrophobic, the city's underbelly swallowing them whole. Headlights flared in the distance, police cars roaring to life as Thompson's forces closed in. Rachel's chest burned, her legs screaming, but she kept moving, driven by a primal need to survive. "We can't keep our phones," she gasped, ducking into a shadowed nook beside Ryan. "He'll track us." He nodded, his face slick with sweat, and they powered down their devices, severing the digital threads that could betray them. Every alley they darted through, every corner they turned, was a gambler race against the tightening noose of Thompson's wrath. The streets gave way to the city's ragged edge, where abandoned warehouses loomed like forgotten giants. They slipped inside one, the darkness swallowing them as they crouched behind crumbling crates. Ryan's hands shook, his breath ragged, but his eyes still burned with that stubborn resolve. "I didn't think it'd go this far," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the distant wail of sirens. Rachel rested a hand on his shoulder, her touch steadying him. "We did what's right, Ryan. Thompson won't quit, but neither can we. If he catches us, it's over for both of us." The sirens grew louder, lights flashing through the warehouse's broken windows. Thompson was closeted close. "We've got to go," Rachel whispered, urgency lacing her words. Ryan gripped her hand, and they slipped out a side exit, the sounds of boots and shouts nipping at their heels. They wove through the shadows, exhaustion clawing at them, until they reached the forest's edge. The trees loomed tall and dense, a sanctuary of darkness. They plunged in, branches snagging at their clothes, their breaths loud in the stillness. Ryan's voice broke through, tired but firm. "What now? We can't just keep running." Rachel paused, her mind racing as she scanned the woods. "We need a way out and a signal to reach my superiors. If we can find a safe spot, I'll call for help." Ryan nodded, and they pressed deeper into the forest, the shadows their shield, their every step a testament to the unyielding fight for justice. Thompson's power had warped the world around them, but Rachel and Ryan were proof that even the smallest acts of defiance could spark a revolution that would burn until the truth stood tall. The night was cloaked in an oppressive stillness, broken only by the frantic thudding of hearts racing in unison. Rachel's chest burned with a fierce, unyielding fiery, a molten blend of desperation to survive and a hunger for justice that refused to be extinguished. Beside her, Ryan moved with equal determination, his breath ragged but steady as they pressed forward through the suffocating darkness. The forest stretched endlessly round them, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, and they clung to the fragile hope that this forsaken place might shield them from Thompson's relentless pursuit, at least for now, at least until they could unravel the tangled web of corruption he'd spun and expose the raw, ugly truth festering beneath it all. Every step was a gamble, every rustle in the undergrowth a potential betrayal. But they couldn't stop, not when the stakes were this high, not when the cost of failure was their lives. After what felt like an eternity of flight, they stumbled into a small clearing, a rare pocket of calm amid the chaos. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the faint chirping of crickets offered a deceptive lull. Rachel's legs trembled as she sank to her knees, her lungs screaming for relief, while Ryan leaned against a gnarled tree, his chest heaving. The moment was fleeting, a stolen breath in a storm, and they seized it to regroup. Rachel fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick with sweat and grime, and dialed a number she knew by heart. The line crackled to life, and a voice warm, familiar, grounding it through the static. "Rachel, it's Alex. Where are you?" Her FBI colleague's tone carried a quiet urgency, a lifeline in the void. Rachel swallowed hard, forcing her voice to steady as she poured out the nightmare they'd endured. She spoke of Thompson, the man who'd twisted his badge into a weapon, who'd abused his authority with a ruthless hand. She described the manhunt he'd unleashed, how he'd rallied a cadre of loyal officers to hunt her down, silencing anyone who dared to defy him. Her words trembled with outrage, but beneath it lay a steely resolve she wouldn't let him win. Alex listened, his silence heavy with understanding, before responding. "Rachel, we'll send reinforcements, but you need to find somewhere safe to hole up. Thompson won't stop, not if he knows you can unravel his secrets." Gratitude flooded her as she thanked him, then turned to Ryan, her voice firm despite the exhaustion clawing at her. "We've got to hold on. Help's coming, but until then, it's just us. We protect each other." Ryan's eyes met hers, a flicker of fear giving way to a hardened resolve. He nodded, standing taller, his loyalty a silent vow as he braced himself to face whatever came next. Back at the station, Thompson paced like a caged beast, his mind a churning sea of paranoia and rage. Rachel wasn't just a thorn in his side, she was a dagger poised at his throat, threatening to topple the empire of control he'd built on lies and intimidation. He couldn't let her slip through his fingers, not when she held the power to expose him. His colleagues milled around him, their faces a mix of reluctance and dread. But Thompson didn't care. He barked orders with a venomous edge, dangling promises of rewards to the obedient and threats to the hesitant. "She doesn't leave this forest alive," he snarled, his voice low and guttural, a predator's growl. Anyone who helps her answers to me. His authority was absolute, a dark shadow that bent others to his will. He orchestrated his hunt with meticulous cruelty, plotting ambush points along the winding trails he suspected Rachel and Ryan might take. Officers fanned out into the night, armed with flashlights that sliced through the gloom and tracking devices that hummed with cold precision. Thompson had turned the forest into a battlefield, vowing to leave no corner unsearched, no escape unblocked. For him, this wasn't just a chase site, it was a war to preserve his dominion, a desperate bid to bury the truth beneath the weight of his power. Out in the wilderness, Rachel and Ryan pushed deeper into the unknown, their senses sharpened to a razor's edge. The terrain was unforgiving. Jagged rocks jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and dense thickets clawed at their clothes as they wove through the underbrush. They chose the hardest paths, the ones least likely to be followed, scrambling over moss-slick stones and wading through shallow, icy streams that numbed their legs. Each crossing was a calculated risk, a chance to erase their tracks, but it came at a cost. Rachel's muscles ached, her body screaming for rest, yet the fear pulsing through her veins kept her moving. Behind her, she could feel Thompson's presence like a storm gathering on the horizon, relentless, suffocating, inevitable. As they clambered up a steep, rocky incline, a beam of light pierced the darkness, followed by the staccato crunch of boots on gravel. Her heart lurched into her throat. She grabbed Ryan's arm, pulling him into a shadowed crevice between two boulders, and they pressed themselves against the cold stone, barely daring to breathe. Thompson's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, slicing through the night. "Search every inch. She can't hide forever." His men fanned out, their flashlight beams dancing like specters across the trees. Rachel's pulse hammered in her ears, her body rigid with tension, but she willed herself to stay silent. Beside her, Ryan's face was a mask of focus, his eyes locked on the danger ahead, every muscle coiled to shield her if it came to that. The lights lingered, sweeping dangerously close, before finally retreating. Only then did they exhale, a shared breath of relief, and resume their flight with a renewed, frantic urgency. The forest became their crucible, testing them with every step. They waded through streams so cold their teeth chattered, climbed ledges so high the wind howled in their ears, and crouched beneath canopies so thick they blotted out the stars. Each time a flashlight flickered in the distance, they froze, hearts pounding, waiting for the threat to pass. Thompson's men were relentless, their search methodical and aggressive, guided by his intimate knowledge of the land. He'd lived here, ruled here, and that familiarity gave him an edge that tightened the noose around Rachel and Ryan. With every passing hour, the pressure was a living thing, a dense fog that wrapped around them, threatening to choke their hope. Yet it only steeled Rachel's spirit. She thought of the lives Thompson had crushed, the justice he'd perverted, and the fire in her chest flared brighter. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the treetops with a faint golden glow, she realized they'd survived another night. They paused in a hollow, gasping for air, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. "We're not done yet," she told Ryan, her voice steady despite the weariness dragging at her limbs. "Thompson will pay for this, he swore it, but we have to stay alive for that to happen." Ryan's gaze held hers, a quiet strength shining through his exhaustion. "I'm with you," he said simply, and in that moment, their bond was forged anew, tempered by the trials they'd endured. Their journey led them to an abandoned cabin, a crumbling relic swallowed by the forest's embrace. Its walls sagged under the weight of time, and the roof rotted and cracked, let slivers of moonlight spill inside, casting eerie patterns across the dusty floor. It was a desperate refuge, but it felt like fate. This would be their stand, the place where they'd face Thompson head-on. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of decay. Rachel's hands shook as she explored the dim space, her fingers brushing against splintered wood and rusted nails. She found a wooden plank, weathered but solid, and gripped it like a lifeline. Ryan, still reeling from their ordeal, scoured the shadows and unearthed a metal rod, its surface pitted with age but sturdy enough to wield. They moved in silence, their breaths loud in the stillness, every creak of the floorboards amplifying the tension coiling within them. Outside, The sounds of Thompson's men faded, their retreat a fleeting reprieve. He was coming alone now, driven by a need to crush them himself, to prove his supremacy with his own hands. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as heavy footsteps approached, each one a hammer strike against the fragile calm. Thompson stepped into the doorway, his silhouette framed by the moonlight, his eyes glinting with a cold, predatory sheen. His face was a twisted mask of hatred and madness, his lips curling into a sneer as he locked eyes with Rachel. "You really thought you could run from me?" he hissed, his voice dripping with arrogance and malice. "That little badge won't save you now." Rachel straightened, her spine rigid, her gaze unflinching. "You can hunt me, Thompson. You can abuse every ounce of power you've stolen. But the truth doesn't bend to your will. I'm not afraid of you." His laughter erupted, a harsh, hollow sound that filled the room and made the walls feel closer. "Truth," he spat, his tone thick with contempt. "I am the truth here. I decide who stands and who falls. You're nothing but a ghost waiting to be buried." The air snapped with violence as Thompson lunged, his speed and strength a brutal force. Rachel darted aside, but he was too fast, slamming her against the wall with a bone-rattling thud. Pain flared through her, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to yield. Ryan, his fear swallowed by loyalty, swung his rod at Thompson's back. The man whirled, his arm lashing out to send Ryan sprawling with a sickening crash. Rachel seized the opening, scrambling to her feet and swinging her plank at Thompson's legs. It connected with a dull crack, and he roared, staggering but not falling. His eyes blazed with fury as he rounded on her. "I'll break you," he snarled, his voice a promise of violence. He charged again, but Rachel was ready, sidestepping and bringing the plank down on his shoulder. He stumbled, and Ryan surged up, joining her in a frantic dance of survival. The cabin's tight quarters became their Thompson's bulk slowed him, his movements growing wild and sloppy as his confidence frayed. Rachel saw it then. His arrogance had blinded him, turned him into a beast thrashing without purpose. With a final, desperate swing, she struck his knee, and he crumpled, clutching the injury as agony twisted his features. He glared up at her, venom in his eyes. "You think this is over? I'll haunt you forever." His words echoed, a hollow threat in the face of his defeat. Rachel stood over him, breathing hard, the plank still trembling in her hands. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a reckoning, a force that toppled even the mightiest when they dared to wield power as a weapon against the innocent. Thompson's fall was a lesson carved in blood and sweat. Corruption could rage, but it couldn't outrun the truth. She and Ryan had fought not just for their lives, but for something greater, a world where the scales could tip back toward fairness. As the dawn light grew stronger, she knew their battle wasn't over, but this moment was theirs, and it was enough. The air inside the cramped cabin felt thick with tension as Rachel stood tall, her eyes locked onto Thompson's with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through him. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade, steady and unyielding. "Thompson, you're not the law, you never were. All this power you've clung to, it's nothing but a mirage, and it's crumbling now. The truth is clawing its way out, and the FBI knows every dirty secret you've buried. They're coming for you." As her words hung in the air, a faint wail of sirens began to rise in the distance, growing louder with every heartbeat. Beams of harsh white light sliced through the narrow gaps in the cabin's weathered wooden walls, painting jagged streaks across the dusty floor. The reinforcements Rachel had summoned were closing in, and the reality of it hit Thompson like a punch to the gut. His head snapped to the side, eyes darting toward the sound, a flicker of raw panic breaking through the mask of control he'd worn for so long. For years, he'd thrived on the belief that he was untouchable, a man who could bend the world to his will. Now, that illusion was shattering. His chest tightened as his heart thundered against his ribs, a primal rhythm like a trapped beast clawing at its cage. The cabin, once a sanctuary where he'd orchestrated his schemes in the shadows, now felt like a trap snapping shut around him. Rachel and Ryan, her steadfast partner, eased back a few steps, their movements deliberate as they kept their distance. The door burst open, and FBI agents stormed in, their boots pounding the floorboards, weapons drawn, faces set with grim determination. The chaos swallowed the room whole, a whirlwind of shouts and motion, that left Thompson reeling. Inside his mind, time seemed to twist and stretch, each second dragging painfully as the weight of his downfall pressed down on him. He'd spent years crafting escape route stashes of cash hidden in hollowed-out books, fake identities tucked away in safe deposit boxes, backroads memorized like the lines of his own hands. But now, under the blinding glare of headlights flooding through the windows, those plans felt like the desperate scribbles of a child. A bitter tide of regret surged up from deep within him, not for the lives he'd ruined or the laws he'd trampled, but for the ambitions he'd never see through. He'd once pictured himself breaking free of this small, suffocating town, living a life where fear didn't shadow his every step, where he didn't wake each morning braced for the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. Those dreams, once so vivid they'd fueled his every ruthless move, now slipped away like smoke through his trembling fingers. Thompson's gaze flickered around the room, searching for a way out, but every corner was bathed in light, every exit blocked by the agent's unyielding presence. He couldn't stop the flood of memories crashing over him, immense from a life that could have been different. As a young man, he'd been sharp, brimming with potential, the kind of kid teachers praised and friends envied. But somewhere along the way, he'd taken a turn down a shadowed path, chasing power instead of purpose. Each choice had pulled him deeper into a mire of corruption, a spiral he hadn't seen until it was too late. He thought of the people he'd pushed away as sisters' disappointed letters he'd stopped answering, the friends who'd faded into strangers after one too many broken promises, all sacrificed on the altar of his own greed. Had there been another road, one where he could have lived simply, honestly, free from this suffocating reckoning? The question gnawed at him, deepening the ache in his chest. The sirens wailed louder now, a relentless howl that mirrored the storm in his head. Fear twisted into something hotter, sharper, anger at himself for letting it come to this, for misjudging the game so badly. Anger at Rachel, standing there with her unshakable resolve, and Ryan, hovering nearby like a quiet sentinel. His eyes flashed with resentment, a brief flare of defiance, but it fizzled out as quickly as it came. He was powerless, a king stripped of his crown, and the realization crushed him. The regret returned, heavier this time, a tidal wave that dragged him under. He knew the agents wouldn't hesitate. They'd lock down every door, every window, every half-baked plan he'd ever dreamed up. His hands shook as he raised them to his face, fingers icy and numb, as if his body was already surrendering what little fight he had left. Above him, the ceiling loomed, rough and stained, and for a fleeting moment, he stared at it, half hoping some miracle might descend to pull him from this nightmare. But the steady thud of approaching footsteps shattered that fantasy, each one a hammer strike against his fraying nerves. Loneliness wrapped around him like a cold shroud. Once, he'd had loyal followers, men and women who'd jumped at his every command, who'd turned a blind eye to his crimes for a cut of the profits. Now, they were gone, scattered to the wind, leaving him to face this alone. No one was coming to save him. The bitter taste of his own mistakes coated his tongue as the agents closed in, their shadows stretching across the floor like bars of a cage. Then, a shift stirred within him, a quiet, reluctant acceptance. Maybe this was always how it would end. Part of him wanted to bolt, to scream and claw his way out of the cabin, to fight until his last breath. But another part, deeper and wearier, stayed still, resigned to the inevitable. He closed his eyes, a bead of sweat tracing a slow, frigid path down his forehead. His breath shallow and ragged. The moment he'd dodged for years was here, and there was no running from it now. Rachel stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. Her voice rang out, firm and unshaken. "Thompson, it's over. You can't hide from this forever." Behind her, the FBI agents stood like a wall of justice. Among them, colleagues who'd known Thompson for years, men like Agent Harris, who'd once shared beers with him at the local bar, and Agent Lopez, whose quiet disapproval had always lingered unspoken. Now, they watched him bow his head, the weight of his crimes bending his shoulders. As the agents fanned out, rifling through the cabin, they uncovered a trove of damning evidence, files Rachel had spent months compiling, each page a testament to her relentless pursuit. The documents laid bare Thompson's web of corruption. Bribes slipped into the hands of local officials, deals struck with petty criminals who'd terrorized the town for years, all hidden under a veneer of authority. The proof was undeniable. A noose tightening around his neck, handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the metal cold and unforgiving. Thompson's voice rasped out, weak and desperate. You don't get Edie did what I had to keep this town safe. But the excuse rang hollow, a flimsy shield against the truth. Rachel's colleagues, joined by local cops who'd finally seen through his lies, exchanged looks of disgust. No one bought his story anymore. Outside, word of his arrest spread like wildfire through the town, igniting a roar of outrage. People who'd suffered under his rigged shopkeepers he'd extorted, families he'd intimidated stepped into the light, their voices rising in a chorus of long-suppressed pain. They recounted tales of his arrogance, how he'd laughed off complaints, threatened anyone who dared question him, ruled with a fist wrapped in false promises. Each story was a shard of glass, piecing together a portrait of a man who'd wielded power like a weapon. The town's anger swelled, an unstoppable current washing away years of fear. Even Thompson's old alias cops like Deputy Miller, who'd ignored the rumors for a quiet life, and Councilman Reed, who'd pocketed his bribes, felt the heat of the FBI's scrutiny and the community's glare. They couldn't hide anymore. Thompson's fall cracked open the town's foundations, forcing everyone to confront the rot he'd nurtured. Leaders scrambled to overhaul their systems, vowing transparency, while whispers grew louder. How many more Thompsons were out there, lurking in the shadows? His arrest wasn't just a personal collapse, it became a rallying cry, a spark that reignited the town's hunger for justice, a reminder that unchecked power always meets its reckoning. For Rachel, the victory was bittersweet. As Thompson was hauled away, she felt a weight lift, a burden she'd carried through sleepless nights and endless dead ends. Years of fighting against him, against the system that propped him up, had forged her into something stronger, unbreakable. Ryan approached, his usually stern face softened by a faint smile. Rachel, you did it. Not just for you, but for everyone who still believes in what's right. She nodded, pride flickering in her eyes, a quiet triumph warming her core. Standing there, watching the red and blue lights fade into the dawn, she felt a deep peace settle in. This wasn't the end of the war. People like Thompson would always rise again, but she knew she'd face them head-on, armed with the same fierce belief that had brought her here. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden rays through the trees, the town stirred awake to a new day. Rachel stood in the police station courtyard, the air crisp with promise. Hours earlier, she'd faced down corruption in this very spot. Now, it felt like sacred ground. Her colleagues flanked her, their silent support a lifeline through the storm. We can't stop here, she said, her voice steady with resolve. This is bigger than one man, it's about all of us. They nodded, understanding the fight stretched far beyond Thompson, into the heart of a community ready to reclaim its soul. For Rachel, it was a beginning, a vow to keep pushing, to ensure justice wasn't just a fleeting victory, but a lasting truth. In a world riddled with shadows cast by corruption, Rachel stood as a beacon of unyielding resolve, her heart pounding with a fierce determination to uproot every wrongful act and dismantle every abuse of power she encountered. She wasn't just fighting for herself, her mission extended far beyond personal vendettas. It was a crusade for every soul crushed beneath the weight of oppression, every voice silenced by fear. She understood that Thompson, a man whose name once struck terror into the hearts of the innocent, was merely a single thread in a sprawling tapestry of deceit. Those who shielded him, faceless manipulators pulling strings from the darkest corners of the system, remained at large, and Rachel burned with a quiet fury to drag them into the light. With every piece of evidence she gathered, her hands trembled not from fear but from the sheer weight of purpose, knowing she was peeling back layers of a festering wound that had plagued her community for too long. Her voice rang out in the dimly lit meeting room, steady and resolute, cutting through the heavy air like a blade. We need to find those who buried the truth, the ones who propped up these abuses of power, she declared, her eyes blazing with conviction. Around her, her colleagues, since weary and uncertain, nodded, their faces alight with a newfound fire kindled by her courage. They weren't just agreeing, they were awakening. Rachel's strength in the face of overwhelming adversity was a spark that ignited something deep within them, a realization that they stood at a crossroads where the possibility of real, lasting change shimmered on the horizon. She could feel a shift in their spirits, the way their shoulders squared as they absorbed her words. They were no longer just a group of agents. They were a united front, bound by a shared hunger for justice. Outside the police station, the wind carried the faint scent of spring, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within Rachel's soul. She walked with purpose, her footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement, each one a testament to the promise she'd made to herself. She wouldn't stop, not after the battles she'd already fought, not when so many still depended on her. The faces of the oppressed flashed through her mind, a mother clutching her child, eyes wide with terror, a young man whose dreams had been trampled under Thompson's boots. Their pain fueled her, a constant reminder that this fight was bigger than her own survival. As she gazed out at the town she'd sworn to protect, the weight of the road ahead settled over her, long and treacherous, littered with obstacles she couldn't yet see. But with every step, her vision sharpened, her purpose crystallized. She wasn't just battling for herself, she was a warrior for the voiceless, and she'd carry that mantle no matter the cost. Inside the FBI office, the air buzzed with a quiet intensity as Rachel laid out her vision. "We need training programs accountably, ethics, not just for the police but for everyone in the justice system," she said, her voice steady but brimming with passion. "We have to rebuild trust, piece by piece, until the community knows the law stands with them, not against them." Her colleagues leaned in, their eyes locked on her, drinking in every word. Among them was James, a grizzled veteran whose cynicism had long ago dulled his ideals until now. His weathered hands clenched into fists, not from anger, but from a rekindled belief that they could be more than cogs in a broken machine. Then there was Maria, younger and softer spoken, whose gentle demeanor hid a steel resolve. She nodded fiercely, her mind already racing with ways to turn Rachel's words into action. The room pulsed with unity, a collective heartbeat of determination that drowned out the doubts that once lingered in its corners. Rachel pressed on, her voice rising with urgency. "We need a system where people aren't afraid to speak, where power doesn't shield cruelty. We have to protect our own colleagues, the civilians, everyone, and lead by example. We're the ones who will rewrite what justice means." Her heart swelled as she spoke, a rush of exhilaration coursing through her veins. These weren't just co-workers anymore. They were comrades, bound by a mission that transcended titles and badges. She could see it in their iced flicker of hope, the resolve hardening into something unbreakable. As she stepped away from that meeting, the morning sun bathed her in golden light, and she felt a surge of possibility. This wasn't the end of her journey, it was the beginning of a revolution, one she'd lead with every ounce of her being. The trial of Thompson unfolded like a storm breaking over the town, its thunder reverberating through every street and home. For days, the courtroom stood as a crucible of truth, packed from dawn with a restless crowd, not just victims, but onlookers, neighbors, and strangers drawn by whispers of justice finally taking root. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of their anticipation, the air thick with the mingled scents of sweat and old oak. Thompson sat there, stripped of his once imposing uniform, his head bowed low, a shadow of the tyrant he'd been. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, now darted nervously as the prosecution's voice boomed through the room, laying bare his sins with surgical precision. Every email, every forged report, every trembling testimony was a brick in the wall of evidence that rose around him, unassailable and suffocating. Rachel moved through the chaos with quiet grace, her mind a whirlwind of focus and emotion. She worked tirelessly alongside the prosecutors, her hands steady as she handed over files, her voice calm as she reassured witnesses trembling at the thought of facing their tormentor. She remembered the first time she'd met them, how their eyes had flickered with fear, how their voices had cracked as they whispered their stories. Now, as they took the stand, she saw something new, a fragile but growing courage, a refusal to let their pain stay buried. There was Sarah, a woman whose soft voice shook with defiance as she recounted Thompson's threats against her family, her hands gripping the podium until her knuckles whitened. And Michael, a man whose broad shoulders slumped as he spoke of fleeing his home, his voice breaking as he described the bullying that had shattered his life. Each word they spoke was a wound laid bare, A cry that pierced the silence of the courtroom and left even the hardest hearts aching. The testimonies piled up, a chorus of anguish and resilience that drowned out the feeble protests of Thompson's defense. His attorney, a weary man with a pinched face, scrambled to paint him as a misunderstood servant of the law, buckling under pressure. But the evidence was a tidal wave, sweeping away every excuse, every lie. The judge, a stern figure with gray hair and piercing eyes, leaned forward, her questions sharp and unrelenting. Cutting through the haze of desperation, Thompson's team tried to spin. Day after day, the room grew heavier, the air charged with the weight of long-hidden truths clawing their way into the open. Rachel sat among her colleagues, her chest tight with a mix of dread and hope. Knowing this was more than a trial, it was a reckoning. When the verdict came, silence swallowed the courtroom. A breathless pause before the judge's voice rang out. Guilty in every count, abuse of power, intimidation, violations of the very rights he'd sworn to uphold. The gavel fell, a sound that echoed like a thunderclap, and Rachel felt a wave of peace crash over her, soothing the raw edges of her soul. Tears pricked her eyes, but she held them back, her lips curving into a quiet, determined smile. This wasn't just her triumph. It was their mother who'd clutched her child, the man who'd lost his home, the countless others who'd suffered in silence. As she looked around, she saw their faces tear-streaked, exhausted, but alive with a fragile hope they hadn't dared to feel in years. Stepping outside, the cool air kissed her skin, and she breathed deeply, her chest expanding as if a vice had finally loosened. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose, and Rachel felt her spirit lift with it. She thought of the sleepless nights, the whispered threats, the moments she doubted she could go on. They'd all led her here, to this victory in it just over Thompson, but over the idea that power could forever shield the wicked. Yet even as relief flooded her, a quiet resolve took root. This wasn't the end. It was a call to keep fighting, to protect the vulnerable, to ensure the system she'd bled for wouldn't falter again. The lesson was clear, etched into every tear and every trembling voice. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from on high. It was a flame that had to be tended, fought for, and guarded with vigilance. Thompson's fall was a stark reminder of what happened when power twisted into tyranny, a warning that echoed beyond the courtroom walls. For Rachel, it deepened her mission, infusing it with a clarity she'd never known. She'd seen the cost of corruption's broken lives, the shattered trust, and she'd seen the strength it took to reclaim what was lost. As she walked into the dawn, her heart thrummed with purpose, her vow to the voiceless ringing louder than ever. She would never stop, not until fairness reigned, not until the shadows of abuse were banished for good.